Oak Bridge, Ohio. Thanksgiving Day. A woman sits at a table she is about to destroy. My name is Sophie Marshall, and for 10 years my family tried to erase me. The dining room smells of roasted turkey and unearned pride, the air heavy with the laughter of men who think they are untouchable. My father raises a glass to my brother, the golden boy oblivious to the legal documents resting under my hand. He thinks I returned to applaud his legacy. He doesn't know that by the time dessert is served, I will have stripped them of everything. They wanted a ghost. Tonight they get a reckoning. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. By the time dessert hit the table, my father wasn't just furious. He was looking at me like I had taken a match to his entire life. I sat at the head of the mahogany table, my hands resting flat on a stack of legal documents that would change the history of this town forever. To my left, my mother was weeping into a linen napkin, and to my right, my brother Ethan looked like he'd been punched in the gut. They thought this was a celebration. They thought I was just the prodigal daughter returning to clap for the golden boy. But the papers under my hand didn't offer congratulations. They offered an eviction notice on their reality. I looked at my father, really looked at him, and saw the confusion warring with the rage. He couldn't process it. He couldn't understand how the girl he'd spent 30 years ignoring had just stripped them of the illusion that they were in control. But to understand how I got here, how I learned that my own blood would rather erase me than ever call me their equal, we need to go back. I wasn't born invisible. In fact, when I was 10 years old, I was loud curious, and usually covered in job site dust. While other girls were playing with dolls, I was in a single-wide trailer on the edge of a muddy subdivision sitting across from my grandpa Jerry. Jerry started Marshall & Sons with a pickup truck and a sledgehammer, and he was the only one who didn't look at me like a placeholder until a son came along. I remember the smell of that trailer's stale coffee diesel and the sharp tang of blueprint ammonia. He didn't give me coloring books. He gave me cost estimate sheets. He taught me to read the jagged lines of a floor plan like it was a treasure map. I learned early that a house isn't held up by walls, but by math. One afternoon, I found a discrepancy in a lumber order for a framing job. A supplier was overcharging us by 15% on 2x4s. I circled it in red crayon and showed Jerry. He didn't pat my head. He nodded, his face serious, and said, "Good eye, Soph. You just saved us $2,000. And that weekend we had the pastor and half the church council over for Sunday pot roast. It was the kind of Midwestern gathering where status was measured by the size of the centerpiece. Jerry, beaming, told the table about my catch. I waited for the praise, my chest swelling with pride. Instead, my father, Thomas Marshall, let out a booming laugh. He wiped gravy from his lip and shook his head. "Well," he said loud enough for the neighbors to hear, "she's going to make some accountant a great wife someday. Save him a fortune on groceries." The table laughed. My mother smiled, that tight, conflict-avoidant smile she wore like armor. Beside me, my brother Ethan, who couldn't tell a rafter from a joist, was being toasted as Marshall & Sons 2.0. I looked down at my plate, the pride draining out of me. That was the first time I felt it. I could feel them quietly trying to erase me from the story, even as I sat right there at the table. As I got older, the erasure became systematic. In high school, when I asked to sit in on client meetings, Dad told me to help Mom in the kitchen. "Family first, Sophie," he'd say, weaponizing the phrase to keep me in line. "We serve the family." I'd stand in the kitchen drying dishes, watching through the glass doors as Ethan was ushered into the study. He was bored, slouching in his chair, playing on his phone under the table, yet he was the prop they needed to sell the image of a dynasty. I saw Ethan present ideas that I had written down for him the night before, and I saw my father clap him on the back for them. The sermons at church about servant hearts started to sound less like spiritual advice and more like a command to sacrifice my ambition so Ethan could shine. The final blow came when Grandpa Jerry died. The heart attack took him fast, and with him went my only advocate. The week after the funeral, I walked into the main office. Dad had already moved into Jerry's big corner suite. On the wall behind his desk, there used to be a framed photo of Jerry and me standing on the foundation of the first house I ever helped survey. It was gone. In its place hung a pristine studio-lit portrait of Ethan wearing a hard hat that had never seen a speck of dust. That night, Dad called a small family meeting. He didn't look at me. He looked only at Ethan when he said, "Son, we're updating the letterhead. One day, all of this company will be yours." He spoke as if I wasn't even in the room. It was like I was already gone, a ghost in my own house. I realized then that if I stayed, I would eventually disappear completely. They wouldn't have to threaten me to make me leave. The silence would do it for them. I decided that night I would go to the city. I would leave town instead of watching them erase me in slow motion. I didn't know then that I would be back, or that when I returned I wouldn't be looking for a seat at their table, I'd be coming to buy it. Leaving was the hardest thing I'd ever done until I realized staying would have killed me by inches. When I packed my sedan for the city, Dad leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed. He didn't offer gas money. He didn't offer a hug. He just said, "You'll run out of steam, Sophie. It's just a phase. You'll be back to help your mother before the snow flies." That refusal to support me was the first gift he unwittingly gave me. It taught me how to survive without a safety net. I enrolled in a university 3 hours away, aiming for a dual degree in finance and civil engineering. I wasn't the trust fund kid anymore. I was the girl pouring lattes at 500 a.m. and answering phones at a drafting firm until 900 p.m. I lived on caffeine and spite, but in those classrooms and cubicles, I found people who didn't care about my last name or my gender. They only cared if I could do the math. I found Professor Natalie Cho, who taught me that a contract is a weapon if you know how to hold it. I met Marcus Hale, a senior analyst, who saw me correcting a structural model over a sandwich break and promoted me on the spot. I drifted toward a specific brutal niche: distressed assets and construction finance. I wasn't just learning how to build skyscrapers. I was learning how to dissect the companies that failed to build them. My first real job out of college was at an advisory firm that specialized in restructuring mid-size contractors. I spent my days looking at the autopsies of family businesses. I learned that pride doesn't pay invoices. I learned that control isn't about sitting at the head of the table carving the turkey. It's about voting shares, personal guarantees, and leverage ratios. I sat in on shareholder meetings via Zoom, watching powerful men get removed from their own companies because they didn't read the fine print. I was training for a war I didn't know I was going to fight. Then came the Tuesday night that changed everything. I was alone in the office, the city lights blurring outside, combing through a stack of reports on companies flagged for high-risk debt. I turned a page and froze. The logo at the top was familiar, a stylized M inside a roof truss. Marshall and Sons Construction. My breath hitched. I pulled the financials closer, praying it was a mistake. It wasn't. The numbers were bleeding red. The debt-to-equity ratio was catastrophic. Accounts payable were 90 days overdue. There were 3 pending lawsuits from unpaid subcontractors, men I probably knew, men who had eaten at our backyard barbecues. The company I had been told was solid as concrete was rotting from the inside out, mere weeks away from being swallowed by a predatory private equity fund that stripped assets for parts. I had to warn them. I picked up the phone, my hand trembling, and dialed my father. I tried to be professional. I kept my voice steady as I laid out the terms: the balloon payments, the cash flow crisis, the inevitable foreclosure. There was a silence on the other end, heavy and cold. Then he snapped. "You've been gone too long to understand this business, Sophie," he spat. "You think you can call me from your high-rise and threaten my reputation with some numbers on a screen. I built this. I know what I'm doing." He hung up. I tried Ethan next. Surely my brother, the future boss, would see the cliff they were driving off. "Relax, Soph." He laughed, the sound tinny through the speaker. "It's high-level strategy. We're leveraging. Dad's got a strategic partnership lined up. Don't embarrass yourself trying to sound smart." A minute later, a text popped up on my screen. "Stay in your lane, Soph. Dad's got this." I sat in the dark of my apartment staring at that text. Stay in your lane. My lane was numbers. My lane was risk. My lane was seeing the train coming when everyone else was admiring the view. If I did nothing, the company would collapse. The workers, the people Grandpa Jerry loved, would lose their livelihoods. The town would suffer. But if I intervened, I would have to destroy the hierarchy my family worshipped. They told me to stay in my lane. Fine. My lane was ownership. I was done letting them strip the future away from everyone who trusted the name on those trucks. I dug deeper into the corporate filings looking for a crack in the armor. And I found it. Marshall and Sons wasn't fully consolidated. Grandpa Jerry hadn't left everything to Dad. He had left small, dormant parcels of non-voting shares to early crew foremen, distant cousins, and even the church building fund. I opened a fresh spreadsheet and typed a new title at the top: redemption plan. Then I started listing names. If they insisted on trying to erase me, I would do what they never believed I could. I would take the pen. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were a blur of highway miles, bitter coffee, and quiet negotiations in living rooms that smelled of dust and old memories. I wasn't just visiting relatives. I was hunting. I tracked down a cousin in Arizona who still cursed my father's name for freezing him out of a contract 10 years ago. I sat in the basement of the community church explaining to the board that the small block of shares Grandpa Jerry had gifted them for the building fund was about to be worthless if they didn't sell to me. I visited retired foremen who still called me Jerry's girl and remembered the little girl with the notepad. My pitch was simple, grounded in the logic my father claimed I lacked. "You're not selling to me so I can gut the place," I told them over and over. "You're selling so we can keep these jobs here. If you trust me, sign." With the help of Devin Reyes, a sharp-eyed corporate lawyer I'd hired, we bundled every signature into a shell LLC. By the Tuesday before the holiday, the math was done. I didn't just have a seat at the table. I owned the table. Thomas arranged the dinner as a coronation. It was a massive Thanksgiving family celebration, with the extended family, the pastor key foreman, and the local banker all squeezed into our dining room. I received an invite via a text from my mother 2 days prior, an afterthought, a courtesy. They expected me to decline. But I didn't decline. I walked in wearing a tailored blazer that cost more than my first car, sensing the setup immediately. They had placed me at the far end near the kitchen door. My internal monologue was calm, almost cold. If they were going to try to erase me in front of everyone, then this time I wasn't leaving the table quietly. By the time dessert arrived, the air was thick with self-congratulation. Thomas tapped his crystal wine glass with a silver spoon, demanding silence. He stood up, his face flushed with wine and pride, and launched into a pompous speech about sacrifice and legacy. "Family," he boomed, resting a hand on Ethan's shoulder, "means knowing when to step aside for the next generation." The room murmured agreement. Then he dropped the hammer. He announced Ethan as the new CEO and revealed a pending strategic partnership with an investment firm, a polite euphemism for the fire sale I knew was coming. The room erupted in applause. Ethan soaked it in, smiling that lazy, entitled smile of a man who has never had to fight for a single thing he owned. I didn't clap. The sound of my silence seemed to cut through the noise. I set my water glass down on the table. Clack. "Dad," I said, my voice steady and loud enough to freeze the room, "are you sure you want to tell that story with all these witnesses here?" The room went dead silent. Thomas frowned, his smile faltering. "Sophie, don't," he warned, his tone dropping to a growl. "Don't you dare try to threaten your brother's big moment with your jealousy." I didn't look away. I reached into my bag and slid a thick, cream-colored envelope down the length of the table. It slid past the turkey carcass, past the gravy boat, and came to rest right in front of Ethan. "I'm not threatening anyone," I said. "I'm just correcting the record." Ethan opened it. His face went pale. Thomas snatched the papers, his eyes scanning the summary of share acquisitions, the legal transfer filings, and the voting proxy statements. "As of this morning, I declared standing up. My entities hold 51.3% of Marshall & Sons Construction. I have already filed an injunction to block the sale. And Ethan cannot legally be installed as CEO without my vote, which he does not have. Thomas turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. You traitor, he sputtered, shaking the papers at me. You stole this company. Linda started sobbing into her hands, wailing that I had destroyed the family. Ethan looked like he was going to be sick, realizing his identity had just evaporated. I didn't steal anything, I said, my voice rising over my mother's cries. I bought it, piece by piece, from the people you ignored. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the banker and the foreman. You didn't just try to erase me from this company. You tried to erase me from this family. You used my name when it was convenient and buried me when it wasn't. Tonight, I simply stripped them of the illusion that I was powerless. I laid out the new reality. The sale was canceled. I would be appointing a seasoned COO from outside the family to clean up the mess. And I was now the chairwoman with final say on every major decision. Thomas slammed his fist on the table, rattling the china. If you go through with this, Sophie, you're no daughter of mine. I looked at him, feeling a strange sense of peace. You already made that choice, I said softly, the day you decided I was easier to erase than to respect. I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving the documents scattered on the table and the room in stunned silence. I walked out knowing I had split my family in two. What I didn't know was whether I'd just saved our town or painted a target on my back. By morning, the story had moved faster than a brush fire in a drought. In a small town, news doesn't just travel, it mutates. I wasn't Sophie Marshall, the returning daughter. I was the snake who bit the hand that fed her. I was the big city brainwashed traitor who stole the company from her own father. My phone lit up with notifications from people I hadn't spoken to in a decade, tagging me in posts, calling me ungrateful and ruthless. The local paper, usually reserved for high school football scores and charity bake sales, ran a front-page story about the Marshall family feud, complete with a stinging editorial questioning my loyalty to the community. I drank my coffee black, reading the words, feeling the weight of the town's judgment settling on my shoulders. When I walked into the company office that Monday, the silence was absolute. It wasn't a respectful silence. It was the quiet of an execution chamber. Conversations died the second I pushed through the glass doors. The administrative staff kept their heads down, typing furiously at nothing. The crew members lingering by the time clocks glanced at me with open hostility and fear. I could read their minds. New owner meant layoffs. Big changes meant outsourcing pension cuts and selling off the fleet. They thought I was there to strip the copper wiring out of the walls and leave them with nothing. I didn't go to my father's office. Instead, I marched straight to the warehouse floor and hit the fire alarm test button, for 3 seconds the signal for an all-hands meeting. 60 men and women gathered, arms crossed, boots scuffing the concrete. I didn't stand on a podium. I stood on a pallet of drywall and projected the real financials onto the white cinder block wall. The red numbers glowed in the dim light, the debts, the pending sale documents, the severance packages Thomas had secretly agreed to for the executives while leaving the workers with zero. I explained it in plain language. If that sale went through yesterday, I told them, my voice echoing off the metal rafters, this building would be a storage unit for Amazon by Christmas. Ray Lopez, a veteran foreman with hands like leather and eyes that had seen 30 years of Marshall promises, stepped forward. Why should we trust you? He challenged, his voice gravelly. You weren't here, Sophie. You were in the city. You don't know us. I looked him dead in the eye. I should be halfway back to my apartment right now, I said. I'm the only one in this family who turned down a payout big enough to buy a house just so we could keep your paychecks coming. The room shifted. The hostility didn't vanish, but the curiosity peaked. I laid out my promises. No mass layoffs. A restructuring plan that started with cutting bloated executive perks, no more company leases on luxury trucks. We would sell idle equipment and renegotiate the bad loans. And if we hit our recovery milestones, there would be a profit-sharing bonus for everyone. It was a start, but the war wasn't over. That evening, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. Go back to the city before you ruin everything. Later, while buying milk at the grocery store, a cousin I used to babysit confronted me in the cereal aisle, loud enough for everyone to hear, accusing me of humiliating Thomas and breaking my mother's heart. When I got home, Linda called. She was crying, her voice thick with manipulation. "You chose money over family, Sophie," she sobbed. "How can you live with yourself?" I almost broke. The guilt was a physical weight in my chest. I wanted to apologize, to fix it, to be the good daughter. But then I replayed Grandpa Jerry's words in my head about responsibility, about the men who built this place with their hands. I channeled that resolve into action. Slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. I implemented better safety protocols that the old management had ignored as too expensive. I ended the practice of unpaid overtime. I personally drove a check to a local supplier who had been hanging by a thread because my father hadn't paid an invoice in 4 months. Sarah, the office manager and a single mom who had been terrified of losing her benefits, walked into my office one afternoon. She placed a stack of files on my desk and paused. "Your dad talked about loyalty but never listened," she said quietly. "You actually listen even when we're mad at you." But listening wouldn't pay the debt service. The climax of the week was a meeting with the bank. I sat across from 3 loan officers who looked ready to foreclose. I pitched them my restructuring plan with the desperation of a drowning woman. After 3 hours of grueling negotiation, they agreed to restructure the worst loan, but there was a catch. I had to hit aggressive cash flow targets in 6 months. The stakes were absolute. If I failed, the bank would move to force a sale anyway, and I'd lose everything I had just fought for. I signed the paper, my hand steady, though my heart was hammering. For the first time, my future and theirs were tied together on paper. If I went down, I wasn't going alone. 1 year later, the silence in the hallways of Marshall & Sons was gone, replaced by the steady, rhythmic hum of a machine running at full capacity. We were finally off the distressed lenders list. The red ink that had stained my spreadsheets for months had turned to a modest, hard-won black. We weren't just surviving, we were building. On the whiteboard in the conference room, the schedule was full of renovation for the local elementary school and a new housing complex for veterans that the old management would have turned down because the margins were too thin. But the biggest change wasn't in the ledger, it was in the air. A few of the older guys who had quit in protest when Thomas left had quietly asked for their jobs back. Even better, I heard the younger apprentices talking about Marshall & Sons not as a sinking ship, but as a place where they could actually build a future. I walked through the lobby, pausing to look at the wall where my father's shrine used to be. The massive portraits of Thomas and the aggressive branding were gone. In their place, I had commissioned a history wall. There were black and white photos of the early crews from the 70s, candid shots of the women who ran the back office, and right in the center, a grainy photo of Grandpa Jerry holding a blueprint open for a skinny 12-year-old girl with a ponytail. Below it, a brass plaque read, "Built by many hands, led by those who remember that." Thomas had seen it. He still attended the quarterly board meetings as a minority shareholder, though he was a shadow of the man who used to bark orders from the head of the table. He sat quietly now, listening as I outlined the quarter's projections. After the meeting adjourned, he lingered in the parking lot while I unlocked my truck. He looked older, smaller somehow in his coat. He scuffed his shoe against the pavement, struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man like him. "I didn't think," he started, then cleared his throat. "I didn't think you could do all this, Sophie. I didn't think you had the stomach for it." It was a half apology, clumsy and late, but it was real. "I didn't do it for you, Dad," I said, opening my door. "I did it for the company." He wasn't the only one trying to bridge the gap. A box had arrived at my apartment the week before from my mother. It was full of old photo albums she had found in the attic, along with a note in her shaky cursive. "We should have seen you sooner. I'm sorry." And then there was Ethan. He was working sales for a roofing contractor 2 towns over, a job he got on his own without the Marshall name to open the door. He texted me occasionally brief updates about his quotas, or a funny thing a client said. On Thanksgiving morning, my phone buzzed with a message from him. I was mad for a long time. Now I'm just trying to grow up. I guess you forced me to. I accepted their apologies, but I kept my boundaries like iron reinforcements. There was no returning control to them. There was no pretending the past didn't happen. I realized that my victory wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about clarity. My worth was never theirs to assign, and it was certainly never theirs to erase. That evening I hosted Thanksgiving dinner, but not at the old family estate. We gathered in my cramped city townhouse where the chairs didn't match and the plates were chipped. The guests weren't political pawns. They were my people. Professor Cho was arguing about zoning laws with Marcus. Devin, the lawyer who helped me launch the takeover, was trying to explain cryptocurrency to Ray Lopez. Sarah from the office was laughing her kids chasing each other around the kitchen island. I stood back with a glass of wine looking at the chaos. This was my chosen family. No one here was trying to threaten me into being small. No one was keeping score. I stepped out onto the small balcony for a moment of quiet, the cold November air biting at my cheeks. I looked out at the city skyline, thinking about that terrified girl who had left home with nothing but a suitcase and a chip on her shoulder. They tried to erase me. At that first table, they stripped me of my place so quietly, I almost believed I never had one. But the thing about being erased is, you're still there. Faint, maybe. Waiting. And if you're brave enough, you can pick up the pen and write yourself back in. Sophie, Ray called out from inside, banging a fork against a glass. We're waiting on you to start the toast. The turkey's getting cold. I smiled, wiped a stray tear from my cheek, and turned back toward the warmth and the noise. My name is Sophie Marshall. I was the daughter they tried to erase. And this company, this town, this loud, overcrowded table is what happened when I refused to disappear. And that brings Sophie's journey to a close. It's a powerful reminder that if you don't like the seat you're given, you have the power to build your own table. What would you have done in her position? Let us know down below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.